All righty, welcome to our Adult Sunday class for this first Sunday of December, December 1st, 2024. We are in Exodus chapter 17. Coming off of those Amalekites and entering the wilderness of Sinai, getting ready for Mount Sinai at long last. And as we have seen, the Exodus Sea crossing was a very, very, very big deal, rightfully so. We spent some time on that. The Lord's work with his people at Mount Sinai, they're going to spend over a year here. We probably won't, but they will. And so we've actually done that before in prior years. So Mount Sinai is, of course, very, very significant. And so one of the things I have for us, let's go ahead and refresh Exodus 17 real quick, picking up in verse 8. Exodus 17:8. Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So let's pull this up real quick. Screen share. There we are. We're getting the itinerary and map route courtesy of Dr. Glenn Fritz. So we are now, let's see, there's a good overhead shot here. So they've crossed the sea, come around here. Through there's Mara, there is Elim, there is Dafka and Alush coming out here to Rephidim in this Horeb area. And it's here in Rephidim. There's the rock in Horeb. This whole area is Horeb. This is the Rephidim side on the south. Up here is the wilderness of Sinai that they're going towards. So they had the incident with the rock in Horeb. Coming off of that, here in Rephidim is where they're dealing with the Amalekites. And from there, they go up here, turn into the wilderness of Sinai, where we have left off. So with that, let's see here. This is the kind of area we're talking about here. Let's go again, Exodus 17, verse 8. Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us and go out, fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. So I kind of envisioned something like that. Joshua did just as Moses told him and fought against Amalek, and Moses and Aaron and Hur went up on top of the hill. So it came about, when Moses held his hand up, that Israel prevailed. But when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. And Moses' hands were heavy. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. So his hands were steady until the sun set. And Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Or swords they got off I keep saying Roman, off of the Egyptian bodies. 14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly wipe out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and named it, the Lord is my banner. And he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. So we'll come back to the Amalekites. And in case anyone was worried that I wasn't going to give our usual intro, I will. We're in the Middle Bronze Age to now going into B with the Amalekites coming across. That brings us from A to B. China still being led by Emperor Ren of the Shang Dynasty. Egypt were under the administration of Pharaoh Dudamos II, who was lost in the Exodus Sea crossing. He's in the 13th dynasty, Egypt's second intermediate period after the Middle Kingdom with Joseph's Pharaoh, and before the New Kingdom with King Tut and Ramses the Great much later on. Babylon being led by Amedi-Tana's king, who's great-grandson of Hammurabi. And in the line of Christ, with the Israelites here, I have Aminadab, I'm guessing about 98. His son Nahshon, I'm guessing about 39. Nahshon's the 29th generation of Adam and is the leader of the tribe of Israel coming out of here. So they're about mid-June here now as they are coming across. They've been going on for over almost 2 months. We're not at the 2-month mark yet. We'll get there in scripture. But before we come back to these Amalekites, because this is such a momentous event here coming on the right up to Mount Sinai here where we're aiming, I thought this would be the appropriate time for some show and tell. So y'all remember there's this series of films called Patterns of Evidence. First was the Exodus, then the Moses controversy. Then they did 2 films on the Red Sea, and then 2 films on the journey to Mount Sinai. Some of us actually went to the theater and saw the first film. And what they did for the two films on Mount Sinai was they looked at 6 possible candidates for which is the real Mount Sinai. And so they go through the first 5, which based on the evidence seem less likely, and end on number 6, which seems the most likely. Now, I haven't been spending a lot of time on what things don't seem to be the case. I haven't wanted to bog down. So the first movie was looking at 3 mountains that probably aren't it. So I almost felt bad wasting folks' time, but I thought, hey, we got to see some pretty visuals, and we got to have some critical thinking and rule out some possibilities. So anyway, the second film, Journey to Mount Sinai Part 2, after dealing with candidates 4 and 5, we finally land on candidate 6, which looks to be the Mount Sinai from the scriptures. So what I thought I would do was I would take the next couple Sundays and show clips just from this last portion of the film dealing with the Mount Sinai here, because I thought what they shared and showed here was pretty significant. And we're going to start at the beginning here, looking at what has happened with people as they've tried to come to this place and what they've encountered when they got there. So this is Journey to Mount Sinai Part 2. And let's see here, we'll get that up there, get the sound on here. Oops, nothing's coming up on the microphone here. Power on. It was working for you, right, Brother Clay? The microphone, test, test, test. It's not working now.
Or did you turn it on?
I've got, yeah, it should be on up there. No, that's one thing that's. Yeah. Test. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Sorry. It turns out it helps when I turn it on. So without further ado, here is the Journey to Mount Sinai Part 2. Again, I'll show this over the next, we'll do over the next 6 weeks, we'll do little 12-minute segments and then have some discussion and come on back to the Amalekites here. So here's Journey to Mount Sinai Part 2.
There's another test for Mount Sinai that some believe is the most important indicator of its location. It comes from an encampment reached after the Israelites left Mount Sinai and came to the edge of the promised land.
In the 2nd year, in the 2nd month, on the 12th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai.
This camp, called Kadesh Barnea, was the base from which Moses sent out the 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan. Several sites have been proposed for Kadesh Barnea, but all are somewhat near each other. Moses appears to record the specific distance from Mount Sinai or Horeb to Kadesh Barnea.
It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea.
Biblical geographer Barry Beitzel did an extensive study of travel days in ancient times, finding that the term travel day was simply the way to communicate a standard distance that equaled about 20 miles. This would be like someone today saying a destination is an hour drive away. On a highway, this would translate to a distance of about 60 miles. Plotting an arc 11 travel days south from the proposed Kadesh Barnea sites and using this 20 miles a day standard creates zones that pass near 3 of the main Mount Sinai candidates, with the others being much too near or else too far. Advocates of the other mountains have various explanations to solve this problem, but it seems like a difficult obstacle to overcome. If the Exodus Sea crossing was at Aqaba, it would leave only one candidate, Jebel Alaz. This mountain was first made prominent in the 1980s by Ron Wyatt and his 2 sons. Because Wyatt was such a big part of the history of this location, I traveled to Tennessee to see Mary Nell Wyatt Lee, Ron's widow.
Ron told me that he had planned to go to Mount Sinai, but he didn't plan to take the boys. But his whole plan was he was going to sneak across the border. The reason being that he had spent 5 years trying to get into that country. but they simply did not have tourism visas. And he was not a professional archaeologist. He wasn't a businessman that could get in there. He just couldn't get in.
So after 5 years, he made a desperate decision.
Yes, he made a desperate decision. And they drove. And they were asking directions. And they asked one man where the mountain was. And he told him, he said, that's Musa Mountain. The people who lived there call that Moses Mountain.
The Wyads were arrested at the mountain and charged with espionage. They would spend 78 days in custody before being released. And their story brought Jebel Allah's worldwide attention in 1984. In 1988, Exodus explorers Bob Cornuke and Larry Williams also snuck into the country, trying to document evidence for the real location of Mount Sinai.
I look at it now and I think, what a crazy thing to do. The desert was just this big, vast, inhospitable place, and we had to cross it to find this mountain. Had no idea where we were going. I didn't like the whole concept of sneaking in, but Larry kind of said, hey, I've spent a lot of money. We got Jim Irwin wanting you to go in. We've got a lot of other people wanting you to get in to see if this is the real Mount Sinai. So I sort of felt almost as if my manhood was in question. So I said, all right, I'll go. And we went into Saudi Arabia.
Then, in the 1990s, Jim and Penny Caldwell began exploring for evidence of the Exodus when they lived in Saudi Arabia, where Jim worked in the oil industry. They had taken family vacations all over the Arabian desert with their 2 children, Lucas and Chelsea. But when they got to Jebel Allah's, they didn't realize how different things would be.
We hear a truck coming in the distance. This Jeep roared up and 3 desert policemen jumped out. And these guys are waving these AK-47s right in the faces of my children and just screaming, Tabuk, 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 back to Tabuk. Get out of here. And you have to understand my viewpoint as a mother. I'm sitting there and I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old with me.
Jim and his son were arrested by frontier forces. After being detained for hours, they were released and told never to return.
It made us furious in a sense because we knew that they were hiding something. Why are they being so volatile about this specific area? It left us with a very strange feeling, but an enormous determination to get back to that site and video and photograph as much evidence as we could so that people who are degreed in this sort of thing could have a chance to look at it to determine whether it is in fact what we think it is.
It was their images taken over the course of 8 years that drew me into the Exodus investigation. In 2003, I traveled to Saudi Arabia with the Caldwells, Dr. Leonard Moeller, and Dr. Glenn Fritz. And although we had permission from the Saudi embassy, we were not welcome at the mountain, and all my footage was taken. As I returned home, I was extremely discouraged. I'd failed. In fact, I became very ill and ended up in the hospital for several days. In the months that followed, I kept thinking, why was this so difficult? For several years, I entered a desert of fear and uncertainty as the investigation stalled. How could I make a film in such a volatile place? To escape, we bought a camping trailer and on weekends headed to the wilderness of Wisconsin. My evenings were spent in front of the campfire, praying for wisdom and direction. And now looking back, it's amazing to see that God was actually not silent, but in different ways began to answer those prayers. And my journey has finally come around to where it began 20 years ago at Jebel Allah's. Is this the mountain where the Israelites came to worship God? I'll begin with the journey to the mountain from the sea crossing. Proponents for Jebel Allah's have proposed 2 main deep water crossing sites on the Gulf of Aqaba, one at Nuweiba Beach and the other at the Straits of Tiran. This brings up a serious challenge from archaeologist Bryant Wood.
one of the claims of these sensationalists is that we should find Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. And that has gotten a lot of press and many followers. And of course, we need to study the Bible. What does the Bible say? Because that crossing took place early on in the journey to Mount Sinai.
Based on the number of campsites, he believes that the majority of the journey to the mountain happened after the sea crossing, not before it. Yet, Jebel Alas is only 35 miles from the sea. So why can't you just go straight from the sea to this mountain over here?
Problem is this ridge of mountainous terrain. It's very difficult to pass through this way unless you take either the northern pass or the southern pass.
Yeah, because after being there, I know that.
Yes, the options to go elsewhere were not available.
During my 2003 trip in Saudi, our group stood on the shore opposite Nubuserre Beach. We were there to retrace the route the Israelites could have taken from the sea crossing to Jebel Alas. Glenn Fritz thinks they crossed at Nubuserre and then journeyed into the interior. It was clear that the wadi was large enough to accommodate a vast number of people traveling up from the sea.
This is the narrowest point in the wadi right up in here, and it's a couple hundred yards wide.
Mm-hmm.
And for 17 miles, they climb uphill to an altitude of about 3,500 feet. And at that point, the descent begins.
Fritz's route then has the Israelites continuing south, following trade routes, before taking an ancient narrow pass into the highlands and the backside of Jebel Alas. Other Exodus explorers are divided on the location of these campsites. Let's look at a few examples.
Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. They encamped there by the water.
Here are several suggested Elim locations from those who favor Nubuserre Beach as a crossing site. There are reports that some of these sites contain 12 wells, and even local traditions connecting them to Moses. Moses records that the Israelites camped twice at Ya-Ammu, once before the sea crossing, and again at Camp 6. With Aqaba, both Ya-Ammu camps would be on the same body of water, which makes sense since Aqaba is so long. However, this is not true for crossings on the small Egyptian border lakes, which have the two Ya-Ammu camps on separate bodies of water. Steve Rudd's crossing at the Straits of Tiran leads to what he believes is the wilderness of Sin. The journey then proceeds on a similar route to Glenn Fritz's, to the backside of Jebel Alas. The Caldwells propose a different route, traveling down the seacoast and then turning up this main travel corridor before taking the northern pass to reach the mountain. Along this journey, they found something they believe is evidence of an amazing miracle that happened at the campsite of Rephidim.
I think one of the most incredible discoveries that we made in all of our journeys into this area was this enormous split rock that we found. We were basically lost, and we were trying to get to the backside of Jebel Alas. We could see a monolith that was standing up on a hill over there. It was about a 200-foot climb to get up to the top of that hill, and this thing went up 4 stories.
They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt, only to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?"
And that's where we will pause for this first segment. So reactions, thoughts, comments, questions on what was presented so far? All good?
Seen other things before where archaeologists or researchers would try to go somewhere or dig somewhere, and the authorities of the area would push back and not let them enter or get near that. So I always find that kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Trying to go over to Area 51 and,
Well,
you know,
You know,
there's something going on.
there's part of it, well, it's like, well, you know, if you don't have permission to be there, you know, but when they have a fence erected around it and. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, you know, it's definitely interesting.
Yeah. So we'll pick up next week with more on that. That brings us back to these Amalekites here that we just read about in Exodus 17. So last week we left off with the Amalekites, where we saw that they were actually coming from Rephidim here in this Horeb area. Let me zoom out here a sec. Coming up to the north here. So this is northern Saudi Arabia. And of course, this is the promised land of Canaan here in the south area of the Negev. So the Amalekites, while the Israelites were coming away from Egypt, the Amalekites were coming up and meeting up with some other folks and coming across here going to Egypt. And we saw how in the Egyptian historical records, Manetho records, during this reign of Pharaoh Dudimos, God, smote their land, and these foreigners, from the east here came over and plundered them, and really asserted themselves. And so we're going to be picking up on that notion here with some thoughts from Egyptologist David Roll on these Amalekites here. Then we'll get back to the Israelites. He actually mentions, let's go to Psalm 78. Psalm 78 in our scriptures here. 2 verses here in Psalm 78, 49 and 50. Psalm 78, 49, he sent his burning anger upon them, fury and indignation and trouble, a band of destroying angels. He leveled a path for his anger, did not spare their souls from death, but turned their lives over to the plague. Okay. Well, David Roll shares this. There's a powerful reference to Egypt's Hyksos oppressors. We saw last week that these Amalekites coming in would be referred to as Hyksos. So there's a Bible reference possibly, and this is right here in Psalm 78, where it says in verse 49, destroying angels or sending evil angels. The correct Hebrew there for evil angels is Malakim Woim. The phrase king shepherds, what the Hyksos are called in biblical Hebrew, is Malakei Woim. So very similar wording there. So these Amalekites, this warrior clansmen of these early Hyksos Amalekite, these chieftains, they brought their families with them into Egypt because, according to Arabian traditions outside the Bible, the disaster that had smitten Egypt had also desolated their homeland, forcing the population to migrate to the relative safety and abundance of the Nile Valley and Delta. We pause right here. So when Egypt was like the breadbasket of the world at the time, and so remember Joseph's family coming during the famines and all that stuff. So the initial devastation of the plagues had a ripple effect that affected other outlying areas. So now these folks, on the one hand, it might not make sense that they're going back to where the source of the problem was, but because Egypt was big, that was a place that, if any place, was going to be able to rebuild itself, have the resources. So people are going back to where resources were, which was Egypt, after they were suffering kind of the ripple effect of this hugely devastating run of plagues here. So these folks coming over would be Asiatic folks coming from the continent of Asia. Remember, this is the continent of Africa here with Egypt. So these Asiatic folks, when the excavations here at Avaris, remember, as you go down, they got the different layers or strata, A, B, C, D. The further down the alphabet, the older in time you are. So as we're going forward in time, we're going up the excavation. So the Israelites were strata G when they departed. These folks coming in are strata F, after them. So these Asiatic folk that the excavator Manfred Betek saw at stratum F were these Amalekites from the Bible coming over, who showed little Egyptian influence. Their rich grave deposits there included damning evidence of their plunder of the native Egyptian Middle Kingdom tombs. The mud brick vaulted tombs of this stratum F males vividly reveal their Amalekite warrior-like character. And here's a quote. Male burials with weapons show a warrior strain in the newcomers, especially at the beginning. They possess very original features. Some of them indeed look rather barbarous. So we've got outside records from the Bible showing these Amalekites coming in and dominating the land. The natives of the 13th dynasty were pushed further south, while these folks came in and dominated the north. So any questions on that? Everyone good there? All right. So some further stuff from the Egyptian historian Manetho. He tells us that these Hyksos, these foreigners, king shepherds who came in, they, quote, treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. So David Wohl shares that the archaeology here has revealed these Stratum F warriors were accompanied by their servants into the next world. The graves there at this mount at Avaris called Tel El Daba, the graves here contain sacrificial burials of young females and provide us further indications of the brutality of these early Hyksos invaders. It is, of course, difficult to identify unambiguously the unfortunate victims as Egyptian girls, but how chillingly these graves reflect Manetho's story of the Hyksos barbarians, quote, leading into slavery the wives and children of the Egyptian men who'd been massacred in the onslaught. So not only were these big bad dudes being buried with their weapons, but slave girls were being sacrificed and buried alongside them to accompany them into the next life. So not a good time for Egypt here. Some further thoughts. The abandoned suburbs at Stratum G, the houses which may have crumbled as a result of the violent earthquake of the Exodus, where the Israelites left, those houses were reoccupied by those Hyksos Amalekite immigrants as a temporary accommodation prior to the building of their own new settlement, that would be from F on to E on up, over the ruins of the old Israelite town. The Amalekite population, along with other disparate Asiatic folks from southern Canaan here, so they mixed in with others. You got some Anakim joining them in this mix coming over here, and some others. Coming from southern Canaan and from this area, the Negev here, they stayed here in Avaris throughout the Hyksos period. They were only removed from Egyptian soil as a consequence of a later war of liberation that's going to happen. It'll be led at first by pharaohs from Thebes down south and of the native Egyptians in the late 17th dynasty. We're still only in the 13th right now. And finally, led by the victorious King Ahmose, who founds the new kingdom that we're not at yet. He will end up kicking out the Hyksos and establishing that new united kingdom. So we're a couple of hundred years before all that happens. So these Hyksos are here for a while. So kind of to sum up, these early Hyksos, invaders of Egypt, were the Amalekite tribesmen who migrated through Sinai from northern Arabia here. This is all northern Saudi Arabia here. So they're coming across here, going around the Gulf of Aqaba and coming back. This marauding army met the Israelites in battle. Then they settled at sites at Avaris in the eastern delta, drove the native Egyptian pharaohs back first to their capital at Ijitawe in Upper Egypt, and then further on down as we saw last time. So these Amalekite warriors, we can identify them as these non-Egyptianized Asiatic newcomers occupying Avaris at the beginning of that Stratum F. So what we're seeing in the dirt matches what we're being told in the Bible and matches what was taking place with Egypt while this is taking place with the Israelites. Does everyone see that? Any thoughts, questions? Anyone fuzzy? We're clear, we're good. So we actually have, let me show here. There we go. Let's go to this one right here. So here's what we're seeing. So starting from the bottom going up, we've got the 12th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom with Joseph and his pharaoh Amenemhat III, who had the dreams. So continuing on, the 13th dynasty, his daughter became pharaoh, Sobek-Neferu, last pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. Then we start falling into the intermediate period after the height of the New Kingdom here. Sobek-Hotep I starting this 13th dynasty. Joseph dies. Hamurbi, famous guy in Babylon. Moses born. Then some really bad pharaohs that we read about in the beginning of Exodus. Neferhotep I, Sobek-Hotep IV. This is all 13th dynasty, bringing us to where we are right now with Pharaoh Dudamos of this 13th dynasty and the Exodus. So coming up from here, we see now in the blue here, these are the Hyksos. And we'll get to Sheshi a little later on. But these are the foreign outsiders who rule Egypt from the north during this time of split. So we got pushed down to the south. There's 13th going into these ones here. So we're at the end of the 13th dynasty of the local Egyptians, including the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Dynasty II. So after the 13th dynasty, the 14th dynasty will be these outsiders from the north, the Amalekites and the early Hyksos. They'll be followed by the 15th dynasty, a little later on, the greater Hyksos. So while that's the 14th and the 5th, excuse me, let me back up. So that's the 14th, they'll be the 17th. So 13th is current. We're seeing the beginnings of the 14th now. Meanwhile, the locals push down south. They'll be the 15th dynasty going into the 16th dynasty. These early Hyksos 14th dynasty will then later they'll have the greater Hyksos in the 17th. So after the 17th, they'll all be kicked out. We'll have the new kingdom with the 18th dynasty. So is everyone ready for the test? So we're in the 13th now. The Hyksos coming in will be the 14th. The native Egyptians pushed down south will be the 15th, followed by the 16th. Later on, the greater Hyksos that'll come around will be the 17th. Finally, they get kicked out, and Egypt will be whole again under the 18th dynasty, and that will be the new kingdom. So that's where we're going, but this is where we are now. So this first king of the first pharaoh of these Hyksos here is there's his scarab seal, his symbol, his identifier there. So these lesser Hyksos or early Hyksos, now 14th dynasty period in Egypt's north. So after the 13th dynasty gets pushed further south. So these migrants, again, probably these military conquerors from the coming down across they came down from Greece and Turkey into Canaan and then on down south as we see here, cross over. So they took over dominion of Canaan, of Egypt in the Middle Bronze Age. And so during that time, they traveled in this region. They were here for about 3 centuries. In the Bible, we see these groups as Rephaim, Anakim, Caphtorim, and Egyptians call them the Hyksos. So this is their first guy, Nubuserre Ya-Ammu. He'll be reigning as Pharaoh of the North from 1446 to about 1439 BC, we're guessing. Hyksos ruler here in the north. We've got the scarab evidence of him. So we're ballparking the reign lengths of him. We don't have a lot of info on the interval between these early kings. What's worth noting is names like his, Ya-Ammu, Yaqub-Ammu, they clearly belong in that same cultural and language family as Yantanammu, who was a king of Byblos up in the north, a century prior. So what Manethos calls the Hyksos, these dynasties here, they're summarized as these are shepherds who are brothers from Phoenicia and the foreign kings. So we see that their genealogy, they come down. And archaeologically speaking, the evidence from that site there at Tel el-Daba of Ars is entirely consistent, showing that this early Hyksos culture came from that Canaan area. Of course, we know the Amalekites coming through Amalek, grandson of Esau. So with these pharaohs in the north, these foreign Hyksos, down in the south in the 13th dynasty, now we have the late great Dynasty II, pharaoh of Egypt, replaced in 1446 BC by a new pharaoh of the 13th dynasty in the south named Ibi something Maatre. The name gets cut off there. So he's ruling the 13th dynasty. So that's what we've got on the Hyksos, and that will bring us back to the Israelites and back to Exodus. Everyone good on the Hyksos there? All righty. So while the Hyksos are in the north and the Egyptians are pushed to the south, we are back in Exodus. We'll skip over Exodus 18 for a moment and go to Exodus 19. So Exodus 19, let's look at the first 2 verses. Zoom out a bit here. Okay. So here's the rock in Horeb. This is the Rephidim area where they fought the Amalekites. And we show them coming up, making this turn to the wilderness of Sinai where they had the shiprock and all that stuff. Here's the wilderness of Sinai and coming up to Mount Sinai here. So they're making their way up into here, coming up the backside. Exodus 19, 1 and 2. In the 3rd month, after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. Pause right there. We can also add to this Numbers 33. one verse here, Numbers 33:15, which also tells us, Numbers 33:15, they journeyed from Rephidim and camped in the wilderness of Sinai. So the key thing here is Exodus 19 tells us it's the third month on the very same day. So they left the day after Passover. Passover is in the first month, Nisan or Abib. And so Passover is on the 14th. They left the very next day, the 15th of Nisan. And so that was the first month. So then the second month would be Iyar, and then now they're in the third month, Sivan. So they're on the very, it says in that third month on the very same day. So the third month minus the first month, it's been a 2-month journey. So from the 15th of the first month past the 15th of the second month to the 15th of the third month, that's a total of 60 days. So they're now on the 15th of the third month on day 60 of their travel. So we're getting into late June here. From this turnoff here, it's another 29 miles that they've been going here. Mount Sinai is 233 miles from their sea journey where they crossed up here and came down around. So that's been a 233-mile journey. So total distance, back to Glenn Fritz here, move up a bit. Total distance between this entry into Rephidim here at this Kareta Pass and the arrival at the eastern base of the mountain, Jebel al-Makla in that Jebel al-Oz range, from here to there, about 76 miles. If the travel pace averaged 8 miles per day as an estimate, journey would have required 9 days to get from here to there. Of course, the slow pace would take into account time required for the water being provided here at the Rock of Horeb, and also their day-long battle with the Amalekites here. So that puts them there at what the Bible says is day 60. So this southern route to the mountain, coming up this area called the Hisma, which we also recognize as Horeb, leading to the base of the mountain Jebel al-Makla, enters the wilderness of Sinai here at this Wadi Ar-Rayt. This track moves uphill to the northwest for 29 miles, gaining over 1,650 feet of elevation to be at the base of the mountain. So in the Exodus, this trek likely involved up to 3 days travel, meaning there would have been a time lag between Exodus 19:2 mentioning entering the wilderness of Sinai, and then them actually making it to the base of Mount Sinai. Again, Exodus 19:1, as we see, gives us the timing of the Hebrews' arrival in the wilderness of Sinai. Glenn Fritz says he understands it to mean the journey between Egypt and the wilderness of Sinai required 2 months, 60 days, 15th day of the first month to the 15th day of the third month. The Hebrews on their journey departed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month, day after Passover, Numbers 33:3. So if Exodus 19:1 stating they arrived on the same day of the month that they left Egypt, that day would be the 15th of the third month, calculates to 60-day journey. The language used in most Bible translations of Exodus 19:1 is indicative of 2 months of travel time. Here are some examples. King James, here's how it reads in the King James, Exodus 19:1. In the third month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came they into the wilderness of Sinai. There's a Bible called the Christian Standard Bible. It says this, in the third month, from the very day the Israelites left the land of Egypt, they came into the Sinai wilderness. The New Living Translation says, exactly 2 months after the Israelites left Egypt, they arrived in the wilderness of Sinai. And as I read New American Standard Bible, in the third month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. So those different translations, all in agreement here, showing that it would be day 60 that they arrive here. Well, that shows that while it's a nice thought, the giving of the law could not have been on the day of Pentecost because that's day 50. That's 10 days ago. And Pentecost hasn't happened yet. It hasn't been given. So that isn't the case. So everyone good with being here on day 60? All righty. What else we got here? You know what? That's actually a good time to pause. I'm using the mouse for laptop, wondering why it's not working on this laptop. So let's see here. There's this mouse for this laptop. Okay, so I'll mark our stopping place here for now, for today. Now you are officially marked. So with the things we have considered this morning, first part of the our section of the film Journey to Mount Sinai Part 2, looking at this travel here and getting up to Mount Sinai. Does anyone have any reactions, thoughts, or questions on the Hyksos in Egypt or the Israelites and this journey to Mount Sinai? All good for now? Good. Glad to see that. So we'll go ahead and stop our screen share for now and stop our recording and get ready to go before the Lord in song together.